The security guard blocked my path before I even reached the ballroom. "Service entrance is around the back," he said, eyes flicking to my boots, still dusted with dried mud from the morning feed. Behind him, my father stepped forward, lips curling. "Just do what he says, Margaret," he murmured loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "You're already embarrassing us." My brother Daniel leaned in, voice low and sharp. "A chicken-raising wife with no real job doesn't belong up front. Try to keep up tonight, okay?" Laughter rippled from his fiancée's table. I swallowed it all steady as stone because none of them knew why I wasn't offended. They thought I was unemployed. They thought I was small. What they didn't know was that the farmland they mocked had quietly built something bigger than all of them combined. As I was escorted past the kitchen doors, a man in a tailored suit stopped mid-stride. His eyes widened. "Margaret Caldwell," he said, holding out his hand. "I didn't expect to see our majority owner back here." The room froze. Daniel's manager stood beside him, pale, smiling tightly. "Sir," he added, glancing at my brother, "if anyone's unemployed tonight, it's not her." I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. And that was only the beginning. The silence that followed stretched like a rubber band pulled too tight. My father's face shifted from smug certainty to something unreadable. Daniel's jaw tightened. His fiancée Emily stopped mid-laugh, her champagne glass suspended in the air. Around them, guests exchanged glances, whispers beginning to circulate like smoke through the ballroom. I stood perfectly still. The server who had been escorting me toward the kitchen entrance looked between me and the man in the tailored suit, confusion plain on his young face. He took a half-step back, unsure of his next move. The venue was everything my family loved to pretend they belonged to. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. White linen tablecloths dressed round tables arranged in perfect symmetry. A string quartet played something classical and forgettable in the corner. The Midwest elite had gathered here to celebrate Daniel's engagement to Emily Richardson, daughter of a prominent real estate developer. This was supposed to be his night, his moment in the spotlight. My father recovered first. He stepped closer to me, lowering his voice, but not enough to hide the edge in it. "Margaret, whatever this isn't the time or place. Let's not make a scene." "I'm not making anything," I said quietly. "I was just trying to find my seat." "Your seat is in the back," my mother added, appearing at my father's elbow. She wore a cream-colored dress and pearls, her hair styled in careful waves. "We thought you'd be more comfortable there, away from the business people." Business people. The phrase landed like a slap wrapped in silk. Daniel approached, his smile tight and performative. He placed a hand on my shoulder, the gesture familiar and condescending all at once. "Look, Margaret, I know things have been difficult since you left the bank, but tonight isn't about you. It's about Emily and me. Just try to blend in, okay? We don't need any distractions." I looked at his hand on my shoulder, then back at his face. I wasn't planning on being one. He squeezed once, a warning disguised as affection, then turned back toward his guests. The man in the tailored suit remained near the kitchen entrance, watching the exchange with an expression I couldn't quite read. His assistant had appeared beside him, whispering something while glancing at a tablet. The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving me. I recognized him, though we had never met in person. William Hartman, Chief Operating Officer of the agricultural supply company that had quietly acquired 3 regional competitors over the past 2 years. A company built on contracts, innovation, and supply chain efficiency. A company I had helped fund through a holding structure that bore my name but never my face. He didn't approach again, not yet. But I felt the shift in the room, the subtle reordering of attention. Guests who had ignored me moments ago now glanced in my direction with curiosity. The server, who had been told to escort me to the service entrance, stood frozen, unsure whether to proceed. My mother leaned close, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever that man thinks he knows, we'll sort it out later. For now, please just go sit down and don't draw attention." I didn't argue. I let the server guide me through a side corridor past the kitchen and into the ballroom through a staff entrance. The table they had assigned me was near the back wall, adjacent to the service station, where waiters loaded trays with appetizers. My table mates were strangers, distant acquaintances of the Richardson family people who had no connection to me and no interest in conversation. I sat down, placed my napkin in my lap, and watched. Daniel stood at the center of the room, shaking hands with men in expensive suits. Emily clung to his arm, her diamond engagement ring catching the light with every gesture. My parents moved through the crowd like performers, smiling and nodding, accepting congratulations as if they had personally orchestrated the union. No one looked toward my table. No one acknowledged that I existed. A server approached with a tray of champagne. I took a glass and thanked her. She smiled a genuine smile that stood in contrast to everything else in the room. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said. I nodded and turned my attention back to the crowd. My father was telling a story to a group of investors, his voice carrying across the room. Something about Daniel's early career, his drive, his ambition, the way he had climbed the corporate ladder through sheer determination. My mother stood beside him, nodding along occasionally, adding details that made Daniel seem even more impressive. They never mentioned me. Not once. It wasn't surprising. I had stopped expecting acknowledgement from them years ago after I left my position at the bank to buy a failing poultry farm in rural Indiana. They had called it a breakdown, a midlife crisis at 32, a waste of an education and a career. What they didn't know, what I had never told them, was that the farm was just the beginning. I took a sip of champagne and watched William Hartman cross the room. He moved with purpose, stopping briefly to exchange words with other executives, but his trajectory was clear. He was headed toward the main table where my family was seated. Daniel noticed him approaching and straightened his posture, extending his hand with practiced confidence. "Mr. Hartman, thank you for coming. It's an honor to have you here." William shook his hand, but his gaze drifted past Daniel, scanning the room until it landed on me. He held my eyes for a moment, then turned back to my brother with a polite nod. "Quite an event," William said. "Your family must be very proud." "They are," Daniel replied. "We've worked hard to get here." William smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you have." He moved on without another word, leaving Daniel standing there with a fading smile and a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. I set my glass down and folded my hands in my lap. The night was young, and they still had no idea what was coming. I stood in the narrow hallway outside the ballroom, listening to the muffled sounds of celebration filtering through the walls. Laughter, clinking glasses, the distant melody of the string quartet. Inside, my family basked in the glow of social approval. Outside, I pressed my back against the cool wallpaper and let the silence settle around me. A young server passed by, balancing a tray of empty glasses. He noticed me standing there and paused. "Ma'am, are you all right? Can I get you anything?" "I'm fine," I said. "I just needed some air." He nodded sympathetically and continued down the hall, disappearing through a service door. Air. That was what I told myself I needed. But the truth was simpler and more painful. I needed distance from the room where I had just been humiliated. Distance from the people who were supposed to love me, but had spent the evening treating me like an inconvenience. The memory surfaced without warning, as it always did, when I found myself in spaces where I didn't belong. 8 years ago. Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' house in suburban Chicago. The table was set with my mother's best china, the one she brought out only for special occasions. My father sat at the head, carving the turkey with surgical precision. Daniel sat across from me, his girlfriend, at the time, hanging on his every word. My mother fluttered between the kitchen and the dining room, orchestrating the meal like a general commanding troops. I waited until the first course was served before I said it. "I'm leaving the bank." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of silence spread across the table. My mother set down her fork. "What do you mean, leaving?" "I've given my notice. My last day is the end of the month." My father stopped carving. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No, Dad. I've been thinking about it for a long time. The job isn't right for me anymore. I want to try something different." Daniel snorted. "Different how you have a 6-figure salary and a corner office. What could possibly be better than that?" "I bought a farm." The silence that followed was worse than any shouting could have been. My mother's face went pale. My father's expression hardened into something cold and distant. Daniel laughed a short, disbelieving sound. "A farm," he repeated. "You're leaving your career to become a farmer." "It's a poultry operation," I said, keeping my voice steady. "In Indiana. The previous owners are retiring and the price was reasonable. I see potential there." My father leaned back in his chair, his gaze boring into me. "Potential. You're throwing away everything we worked for, everything we invested in your education for potential." "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing something different." "You're choosing to fail," he said flatly. "Farmers don't build wealth, Margaret. They scrape by. They struggle. Is that what you want for yourself?" "I want to build something of my own." My mother shook her head slowly. "We didn't raise you to be a chicken farmer." "No," I agreed. "You raised me to be successful, and I will be, just not in the way you imagined." The rest of the meal passed in strained silence. Daniel made a few more jokes at my expense, each one met with approving smiles from my parents. By the time dessert was served, I had been effectively erased from the family narrative. The golden child sat across from me, basking in their approval, while I sat in the shadow of their disappointment. That was the night I understood the truth about my family. Daniel could fail upward forever. He could make bad investments, choose the wrong partners, stumble through career setbacks, and they would always find a way to spin it as a learning experience. But my successes would never count, and my choices would always be suspect. I stopped expecting their approval after that. I stopped hoping for their support. I focused on the work in front of me and let the results speak for themselves. The farm had been a disaster when I bought it. Aging infrastructure, outdated equipment, contracts with wholesalers who paid pennies on the dollar. The previous owners had been kind people who loved the land but had no head for business. I spent the first 2 years rebuilding everything from the ground up. New barns, new processing facilities, new contracts with organic grocery chains willing to pay premium prices for ethically raised poultry. By year 3, I was profitable. By year 5, I was expanding. I bought 2 neighboring farms and consolidated operations. I hired a management team and started exploring vertical integration. By year 7, I had caught the attention of investors who saw what I was building and wanted to be part of it. None of this ever reached my family. I stopped calling after my mother forgot my birthday 2 years in a row. I stopped visiting after my father made a comment about how my hands looked rough like a laborer's hands. I stopped sharing my life with them because they had made it clear my life wasn't worth sharing. Standing in that hallway outside the ballroom, I felt the weight of those years pressing down on me. The decisions I had made, the distance I had created, the person I had become in the space they had refused to occupy. A door opened at the end of the corridor, and William Hartman stepped through. He was speaking quietly into his phone, but he ended the call when he saw me. "Ms. Caldwell," he said, approaching with measured steps. "I didn't expect to find you out here." "Just needed a moment," I said. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I can imagine tonight has been difficult." I didn't confirm or deny. I simply waited. "I've followed your work for some time," he continued. "The way you've structured your holdings, the partnerships you've cultivated, it's impressive, especially given that you've done it with almost no public profile." "I prefer it that way." I gathered. He glanced toward the ballroom doors. "Your brother works for one of our subsidiaries. Did you know that—" I did know. I had known for 2 years, ever since the acquisition that brought Daniel's company under the umbrella of the larger organization. An organization where my investment stake gave me significant influence, though I exercised it rarely and always through intermediaries. "I'm aware," I said. William studied me for a long moment. "He doesn't know, does he, about your position?" "No one in my family does." He nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in his eyes. "That must be complicated." "Less than you might think." We stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the party drifting through the walls. Then William straightened his jacket and offered a small smile. "Well, Ms. Caldwell, I won't take any more of your time, but I suspect before the night is over, the situation may become a bit more public than you intended." He walked back toward the ballroom, leaving me alone with the echoes of his words. I stayed in the hallway for another few minutes, gathering myself. Then I smoothed my dress, lifted my chin, and walked back through the service entrance to reclaim my seat at the table no one wanted me to occupy. They had decided years ago who I was supposed to be. Tonight, they would learn how wrong they had been. The ballroom had grown louder in my absence. Conversations layered over one another, creating a wall of sound that made it difficult to distinguish individual voices. I navigated through the crowd, past servers carrying silver trays, past clusters of guests exchanging business cards and compliments, until I reached the table near the service station where I had been assigned. My tablemates barely acknowledged my return. A couple in their 60s discussed a recent trip to Europe. A younger man scrolled through his phone, occasionally glancing up with bored indifference. An older woman with silver hair and too much jewelry picked at her salad, her attention fixed on the main table where Daniel and Emily held court. I sat down and placed my napkin back in my lap. The server who had helped me earlier appeared at my elbow. "Can I bring you anything else, ma'am? We have a special vintage being poured for the toast." "Water is fine, thank you." She nodded and moved away, leaving me to observe the room from my position at its margins. The main table dominated the center of the ballroom, elevated slightly on a platform that ensured everyone could see the guests of honor. Daniel sat beside Emily, their chairs close enough to suggest intimacy. My parents flanked them, my father engaged in conversation with Emily's father, my mother leaning toward Emily's mother with practiced warmth. They looked like a family portrait carefully arranged and expertly lit. I was not in the frame. Emily rose from her seat and made her way through the room, accepting congratulations from various guests. Her path brought her near my table, and she paused when she noticed me sitting there. "Oh, Margaret," she said, her voice bright with the kind of false cheer that came naturally to people like her. "I'm so glad you could make it. Daniel mentioned you live out in the country somewhere. Must be nice to get away from all that for a night like this." "It is," I said evenly. She glanced at my dress, a simple navy sheath I had bought for occasions exactly like this one, and then at the table around me. "Well, I hope you're comfortable here. I know it's a bit far from the main action, but Daniel thought you might prefer something quieter. You know, given your lifestyle." "My lifestyle? The farm thing." She waved her hand dismissively. "He said you raise chickens or something. How quaint." I smiled. "Something like that." Emily's attention had already drifted elsewhere. She patted my shoulder in a gesture that felt more like a dismissal than a comfort, then glided away to join another group of guests. The older woman with the jewelry leaned toward me. "Friend of the bride. Sister of the groom." Her eyebrows rose. "Really, I didn't realize Daniel had a sister." "Most people don't." She seemed unsure how to respond to that, so she returned to her salad and said nothing more. A photographer made his way through the room, capturing candid moments between posed shots. He approached the main table, directing my family to gather for a group photo. My father stood behind my mother, one hand on her shoulder. Daniel pulled Emily close, their smiles identical and practiced. The photographer counted down the flash fired, and the moment was preserved. No one looked toward my table. No one suggested I join them. I watched the photographer review the images on his camera, showing them to Emily with an approving nod. She laughed and said something I couldn't hear, gesturing toward the crowd. A server appeared at my elbow again. "Excuse me, ma'am. The event coordinator asked me to check if you need anything. She wanted to make sure you were taken care of." "That's kind of her. I'm fine." She also mentioned that the family photos will be starting soon. She wanted to know if you'd like to be included. I paused, surprised by the offer. She asked that. "Yes, ma'am. She said she noticed you weren't at the main table and wanted to make sure there wasn't a mistake." I glanced toward the platform where my family stood still arranging themselves for another shot. My father was adjusting his tie. My mother was smoothing Emily's hair. Daniel was pointing toward something outside the frame, probably directing the photographer. "There's no mistake," I said, "but thank you for checking." The server nodded and withdrew, leaving me alone with the realization that a stranger had shown me more consideration in 30 seconds than my family had shown me all evening. The photographer finished with the group shots and began circulating again, capturing guests at their tables. When he reached mine, he hesitated. "Would you like a photo for the album?" "No, thank you." He moved on without pressing. The toast came next. Daniel rose from his seat, champagne glass in hand, and the room fell silent. He spoke about Emily, about their future together, about the support of their families. He mentioned his parents by name, thanking them for their guidance and love. He thanked Emily's parents for welcoming him into their family. He did not mention me. The omission was so complete, so deliberate, that even strangers at my table exchanged uncomfortable glances. The older woman cleared her throat softly. The man with the phone looked up for the first time, his expression curious. I kept my face neutral and my hands folded in my lap. When the toast ended, applause filled the room. Daniel kissed Emily and the photographer captured the moment for posterity. My parents beamed with pride. I finished my water and set the glass aside. From across the room, I saw William Hartman watching me. He sat at a table near the front, surrounded by executives and their spouses, but his attention was fixed in my direction. He said something to the man beside him, who turned to look at me as well. The man's expression shifted from curiosity to recognition. He leaned back and whispered something to William, who nodded slowly. Something was shifting in the room. I could feel it in the way certain guests glanced my way, in the murmured conversations that seemed to orbit around some piece of information I couldn't quite hear. Daniel noticed the shift. He stood at the edge of the platform, champagne still in hand, but his smile had dimmed. He was watching William's table, trying to read the expressions there. The event coordinator appeared at the photographer's side, gesturing toward the main table and then toward me. The photographer shook his head and continued moving through the room. The coordinator lingered for a moment, uncertainty written across her face. I didn't react. I didn't need to. Whatever was happening, it was already in motion. The wheels had begun to turn long before tonight, long before Daniel stood on that platform and pretended I didn't exist. He was standing on foundations he didn't own, speaking confidently about a future he couldn't control, surrounded by people who were beginning to understand what he refused to see. I was not the failure they had made me out to be, and soon they would have no choice but to acknowledge it. The clinking of glass against crystal silenced the room. The event coordinator stepped forward, microphone in hand, and announced that the family speeches would begin. My father rose from his seat with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to public speaking. He buttoned his jacket, accepted the microphone, and turned to face the assembled guests. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice carrying across the ballroom with professional warmth. "This is a proud moment for our family. When Daniel told us he had found someone special, we knew immediately that he had made the right choice. Emily is everything we could have hoped for in a daughter-in-law." Applause rippled through the room. Emily pressed her hand to her heart in a gesture of practiced humility. My father continued, "Daniel has always been driven. From the time he was a boy, he set goals for himself and achieved them. He graduated at the top of his class. He built a successful career in corporate logistics. And now he's building a life with a partner who matches his ambition and his values." More applause. Daniel smiled and squeezed Emily's hand. "As parents," my father said, glancing at my mother, "we've always tried to support our children in making responsible choices. Some paths lead to stability and success. Others—" He paused, and for a brief moment his eyes flickered in my direction. "Well, not everyone is cut out for the same journey." A few guests chuckled politely, though the meaning was clear enough to anyone paying attention. I kept my expression neutral. But tonight is about celebrating the path Daniel has chosen, a path that leads to partnership, prosperity, and family. Please raise your glasses to Daniel and Emily. The room raised their glasses in unison. I lifted my water glass and brought it to my lips without drinking. My mother took the microphone next. Her speech was softer, more personal, filled with anecdotes about Daniel as a child. The time he organized a lemonade stand and donated the profits to charity. The way he always made sure to call on holidays. His thoughtfulness, his generosity, his capacity for love. She mentioned Emily's grace, her family's prominence, the beautiful life they would build together. She did not mention me. Not once, not even in passing. When she finished, the applause was genuine and sustained. Emily's mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. My father put his arm around my mother and kissed her cheek. Daniel stepped forward to deliver his own remarks. He was polished, confident, every word calibrated for maximum effect. He thanked his parents for their unwavering support. He thanked Emily's family for embracing him so warmly. He spoke about his career, his ambitions, the future he was building. "I've been fortunate," he said, "to work for a company that values innovation and growth. Our recent expansion into agricultural supply chains has been particularly exciting. It's an industry with enormous potential, and I'm proud to be part of the team leading that charge." He smiled broadly, unaware of the weight those words carried. Agricultural supply chains, the industry I had spent the last 8 years quietly conquering. "The partnerships we've built," Daniel continued, "have positioned us for remarkable growth. I'm confident that the next decade will bring opportunities none of us can even imagine." I watched William Hartman's expression from across the room. His face remained politely attentive, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible shake of his head as he leaned toward his assistant. Daniel finished his speech with a toast to love, partnership, and family. The room erupted in applause. Emily threw her arms around him. My parents beamed with pride. The photographer moved in to capture the moment, positioning himself at the edge of the platform for the perfect angle. The event coordinator gestured for the family to gather together. My father, my mother, Daniel, Emily, and Emily's parents arranged themselves in a semicircle, faces turned toward the camera. No one looked for me. The flash fired. The moment was captured, a family portrait without all its members. I watched the photographer review the images, watched Emily lean in to approve the selections, watched my mother suggest a different pose for the next shot. "Excuse me," a voice said near my elbow. I turned to find the event coordinator standing beside my chair, her expression uncertain. "I just wanted to check again. The family photos." "I'm not needed," I said simply. She hesitated. "It's just that the seating chart listed you as family, and I noticed you weren't included in the earlier shots. If there was an oversight, I could speak with the photographer." There wasn't an oversight. She studied my face for a moment, and I saw understanding dawn in her eyes. Not pity exactly, something more like recognition. "I see," she said quietly. "If you change your mind, please let me know." She withdrew, leaving me alone with the noise of celebration and the silence of my own exclusion. The speeches concluded, and the room shifted into a different energy. Guests rose from their tables to mingle, to congratulate, to position themselves near the people who mattered. The dance floor opened. The band began to play. I remained seated, observing the careful choreography of social hierarchy. Daniel worked the room like a politician, shaking hands, accepting compliments, deflecting questions with easy charm. Emily stayed close to him, her smile never wavering her hand, always finding his arm or his shoulder or the small of his back. My parents circulated among the older guests, the established money, the connections that mattered. They spoke in low tones, leaned in close, laughed at the right moments. They were in their element. I was a ghost at my own brother's engagement party. From my table, I watched William Hartman excuse himself from a conversation and make his way toward the edge of the room. He stopped near the bar where a small group of executives had gathered. Their conversation was animated but quiet, their gestures restrained. One of them glanced in my direction, then another. William said something I couldn't hear, and the group fell silent. Daniel noticed the shift. He was mid-conversation with Emily's father when his attention drifted toward the bar. His smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. He excused himself and walked toward William's group, his stride confident, but his eyes uncertain. He inserted himself into the conversation with practiced ease, laughing at something someone said, offering his own observation. William turned to face him directly. "Daniel, good to see you again. Your speech was impressive." "Thank you, sir. It means a lot coming from you." "I noticed you mentioned our agricultural expansion. That's become quite a significant part of our portfolio." "Yes, sir. I've been following the developments closely. The growth potential is remarkable." William nodded slowly. "It is, though I wonder how much of that story you actually know." Daniel's smile wavered. "I'm sorry. Never mind." William said, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "We can discuss it another time. Enjoy your party." He turned away, leaving Daniel standing there with confusion written across his face. I lowered my gaze to my hands, folded calmly in my lap. The first cracks were beginning to show. The band transitioned into a slower melody, and the dance floor filled with couples swaying in careful choreography. I remained at my table, watching the room rearrange itself around the rhythm of money and social position. The older woman with the jewelry had left to join friends at another table. The man with the phone had disappeared entirely. I sat alone, which suited me fine. Near the bar, a cluster of executives continued their quiet conversation. I recognized a few faces from business publications, photographs attached to articles about mergers and acquisitions, supply chain innovations, corporate restructuring. These were the people who made decisions in conference rooms that affected thousands of workers and millions of dollars. They moved through spaces like this one with the ease of ownership. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and a measured demeanor, was speaking intently to William Hartman. I had never met him in person, but I knew his name, Richard Chen, Senior Vice President of Strategic Partnerships. We had corresponded through intermediaries for the past 3 years, building relationships that existed entirely on paper and in carefully worded emails. Richard glanced in my direction, then leaned toward William with a question I couldn't hear. William's response was brief. Richard's expression shifted from curiosity to surprise, to something that looked almost like amusement. He said something else, and William nodded slowly. I took a sip of water and waited. Daniel had returned to the main table where Emily was holding court with her bridesmaids. He sat beside her, one arm draped across the back of her chair, but his attention kept drifting toward the bar. Whatever William had said had unsettled him. My father noticed Daniel's distraction. He leaned close and said something that made Daniel shake his head. They exchanged a few more words, my father's expression hardening before he stood and walked toward the bar himself. I watched him approach William's group with the confidence of a man who believed he belonged everywhere. He inserted himself into the conversation with a hearty greeting, shaking hands and making introductions. William acknowledged him politely but without warmth. Their exchange lasted only a moment. My father asked a question William answered briefly, and then the group's attention shifted away from my father entirely. He stood there for a beat longer than necessary, uncertain whether to push further or retreat. He retreated. When he returned to the main table, his smile was fixed and false. He sat down heavily and said something to my mother that made her frown. I turned my attention back to the executives at the bar. Richard Chen had separated himself from the group and was walking toward my table. His approach was unhurried, deliberate, as if he were simply making his way across the room and happened to be heading in my direction. He stopped beside my chair. Ms. Caldwell, yes. Richard Chen, I believe we've corresponded, though always through counsel. He extended his hand and I shook it. It's an unexpected pleasure to meet you in person. Likewise, Mr. Chen. He gestured to the empty chair beside me. May I? I nodded, and he sat down, crossing one leg over the other, with the ease of a man accustomed to long negotiations. I confess I'm curious, he said. I've worked in this industry for 30 years, and I've rarely encountered someone who builds what you've built while maintaining such a low profile. I prefer to let the work speak for itself. It does. Quite eloquently. He paused, considering his next words. I must admit, when I learned the connection to this particular family, I was surprised. Daniel speaks often about his background, his achievements. He's never mentioned a sister with your credentials. That doesn't surprise me. Richard's expression remained neutral, but I caught the flicker of something in his eyes, understanding perhaps, or calculation. He also doesn't seem to realize that the agricultural expansion he's so proud of is largely built on partnerships your holding company facilitated. He doesn't. And you've never told him. I've had no reason to. Richard studied me for a long moment. May I ask why you're here tonight? Forgive me, but based on what I've observed, you don't seem particularly welcome. I considered the question. Curiosity, mostly. I wanted to see how far they would go. And further than I expected. He nodded slowly. Well, Ms. Caldwell, I suspect the evening may become more interesting before it ends. William is not the type to let certain ironies pass without comment. I've gathered. Richard rose from his chair. It was a pleasure meeting you. I hope we'll have the opportunity to work more directly in the future. I'd like that. He walked away, returning to William's group with a casual word that drew their attention back to the ongoing conversation. At the main table, Daniel had noticed the exchange. He watched Richard's departure with narrowed eyes, then turned to look at me directly for the first time since his dismissive comment at the service entrance. Our eyes met across the room. I didn't look away. He held my gaze for 3 seconds, then 4, before Emily touched his arm and drew his attention back to her conversation. When he turned to respond to her, his smile had lost some of its confidence. The evening was progressing exactly as I had anticipated. They had spent years building a narrative about who I was and what I represented. They had cast me as the failure, the cautionary tale, the daughter who had thrown away her potential to raise chickens in the middle of nowhere. They had never considered the possibility that their narrative was incomplete. At the bar, William Hartman set down his drink and spoke to his assistant. She nodded and moved toward the event coordinator, who listened intently before glancing in my direction with visible uncertainty. Something was being arranged, something that would shift the balance of the evening. I smoothed the fabric of my dress and waited for whatever came next. My family had chosen their side of this story long ago. They had written me out of it, excluded me from the frame, assigned me to a table near the service entrance because they believed I didn't deserve anything better. They were about to learn that the story they had been telling was never theirs to control. The shift was subtle at first. Conversations continued, glasses clinked, the band played on. But something had changed in the texture of the room. Guests who had ignored me earlier now cast curious glances in my direction. The event coordinator hovered near the main entrance, occasionally checking her phone, her expression tight with uncertainty. William Hartman finished his conversation at the bar and began walking toward my table. His approach was measured, unhurried, but it drew attention like a stone dropped into still water. Heads turned, whispers circulated. At the main table, my mother leaned toward my father with a question in her eyes. Daniel set down his champagne glass and watched William's progress across the room with growing unease. William stopped beside my table and offered a polite smile. "Ms. Caldwell, I apologize for not approaching sooner. I wanted to give you some space after the earlier confusion at the entrance." "There was no confusion," I said, "but I appreciate your courtesy. Nevertheless, I should have come to you directly. The situation was handled poorly, and I want to make sure you understand that it doesn't reflect the values of the organization." I gestured to the empty chair. "Please." He sat down, his posture formal, but his expression warm. "I've been looking forward to meeting you for some time. Your work has been exceptional, and the strategic vision behind your investments has shaped the direction of several of our divisions. The team deserves the credit. The team works for you. That's not nothing." From the corner of my eye, I saw Daniel break away from Emily and walk toward us. His stride was deliberate, his expression fixed in the kind of confident smile that usually got him through difficult situations. "Mr. Hartman," Daniel said, stopping beside our table, "I didn't realize you knew my sister." William looked up at him with an expression that was perfectly polite and perfectly cold. "I know her by reputation. We haven't met in person until tonight." "Ah, well, Margaret lives a quiet life out in the country. Not much opportunity for business circles." "Is that what she's told you?" Daniel's smile faltered. "I'm sorry." William rose from his chair and buttoned his jacket. "We should talk more later, Daniel. There are some things about your department that need to be addressed." He turned to me and inclined his head. "Miss Caldwell, it was a pleasure. I hope we'll have the chance to speak privately before the evening ends." He walked away without another word, leaving Daniel standing beside my table with uncertainty written across his face. "What was that about?" Daniel asked, his voice lower now. "You'd have to ask him." "Margaret." His tone had shifted from confusion to something closer to annoyance. "What's going on? Why is the coup of my company coming to talk to you?" "I don't know. Maybe he's just being polite." Daniel stared at me for a long moment, clearly unconvinced. Then he shook his head and returned to the main table where Emily was waiting with questions of her own. I watched them confer in hushed tones, Daniel's gestures becoming more animated, Emily's expression shifting from curiosity to concern. At the bar, Richard Chen was speaking to another executive, both of them glancing in my direction. Near the entrance, William Hartman had stopped to address the event coordinator, who was nodding vigorously and making notes on her tablet. My mother rose from the main table and walked toward me. She stopped beside my chair, her expression a careful blend of concern and irritation. "Margaret, what's happening? Why was that man at your table?" He was being polite. "That man is Daniel's boss, the chief operating officer. He doesn't make social calls during engagement parties. Maybe he's interested in agriculture." My mother's eyes narrowed. "Don't be flippant. If there's something going on, you need to tell us. This is Daniel's night. We can't have any disruptions." "I haven't disrupted anything." "Then why is everyone looking at you?" I met her gaze steadily. "I don't know. Why don't you ask them?" She stood there for a moment longer, clearly wanting to say more, but unable to find the words. Then she turned and walked back to the main table, where my father was waiting with questions of his own. The room had changed. The balance of attention had shifted. Guests who had been focused on Daniel and Emily were now dividing their attention between the main table and my corner of the room. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply waited. The event coordinator approached William Hartman again, and they exchanged a few words before she walked to the microphone stand near the stage. She tapped the microphone once, twice, and the room began to quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice slightly unsteady, "we have a brief adjustment to the program. There will be a short acknowledgement before we continue with the evening's festivities." At the main table, Daniel leaned toward Emily with a question. She shook her head clearly, as confused as he was. William Hartman stepped toward the microphone. The room fell completely silent. I folded my hands in my lap and kept my expression neutral. Whatever was about to happen, I had not planned it. But I had prepared for it. 8 years of building something real. 8 years of being dismissed and diminished. 8 years of proving myself to people who mattered while being invisible to the people who should have cared most. The reckoning was about to begin. William Hartman took the microphone with the calm assurance of a man accustomed to commanding attention. The room had fallen completely silent, guests frozen mid-conversation, champagne glasses suspended in the air. At the main table, my family sat in rigid uncertainty, their expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed alarm. "Thank you for your patience," William began. "I know this is an unusual interruption to the evening's program, but there's a matter of significance that I believe deserves acknowledgement." Daniel shifted in his seat, his hand moving instinctively to straighten his tie. Emily placed her palm on his forearm, a gesture meant to be reassuring, but that only highlighted his visible tension. "Many of you know me as the Chief Operating Officer of Meridian Holdings," William continued. "What you may not know is that over the past several years, our company has undergone a strategic transformation, particularly in our agricultural and supply chain divisions. This transformation was made possible through a series of partnerships and investments that fundamentally reshaped our position in the market." He paused, allowing the words to settle. "The person responsible for structuring many of those partnerships, for identifying opportunities that others overlooked, and for investing in the growth that has defined our recent success, is present in this room tonight." I felt the weight of every gaze in the room beginning to shift toward my corner. "I'd like to recognize Margaret Caldwell." William turned and looked directly at me. "Ms. Caldwell, would you mind standing?" The silence in the room was absolute. I rose from my chair slowly, deliberately, my movements measured and calm. "Margaret Caldwell," William continued, "is the majority stakeholder in Caldwell Agricultural Holdings, which is the primary investment partner behind our organic supply chain expansion. Her strategic vision has generated returns that exceed anything we projected, and her commitment to sustainable practices has positioned us as industry leaders." At the main table, my father's face had gone pale. My mother's mouth hung slightly open. Daniel sat completely still, his expression frozen in something that looked like disbelief. "In short," William said, "if anyone in this room should be acknowledged for business acumen and vision, it's the woman who built an empire, while most of us weren't paying attention." He gestured toward me with an open hand. "Ms. Caldwell." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Richard Chen began to clap slowly and deliberately, Another executive joined him, then another. The applause spread through the room like a wave, hesitant at first, then growing in strength as guests realized what they were witnessing. I nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, and remained standing. Daniel's face had gone from pale to flushed. He pushed back his chair and started to rise, but Emily's hand on his arm stopped him. They exchanged urgent whispers, her expression pleating his jaw tight with suppressed emotion. William continued. I should also note that Daniel Richardson works for one of our subsidiary companies, a company that would not exist in its current form without the partnerships Ms. Caldwell facilitated. He turned to face Daniel directly, which is why I find it particularly interesting that she was seated near the service entrance tonight. The words landed like a physical blow. Daniel's face went blank, then red. Emily looked down at the table. My father gripped the edge of his chair with white-knuckled hands. I believe there may have been a misunderstanding about seating arrangements, William said, his tone mild, but his meaning unmistakable. Perhaps something that should be corrected. The event coordinator hurried forward, her expression mortified. She gestured toward the main table, then toward me, clearly uncertain how to proceed. That won't be necessary, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room. I'm comfortable where I am. William smiled slightly. Of course. My apologies for the intrusion. He set down the microphone and walked toward me, extending his hand. Miss Caldwell, thank you for your patience this evening. I know this isn't how you prefer to operate. It isn't, I agreed, shaking his hand, but sometimes circumstances change. He nodded once and returned to his table, leaving me standing in the center of attention I had never sought. Around the room, guests were recalibrating. The executives who had ignored me earlier now watched with undisguised interest. Emily's mother was whispering urgently to her husband. At the main table, my family sat in stunned silence. I lowered myself back into my chair, smoothed my napkin across my lap, and waited. The band, uncertain whether to resume, began playing softly in the background. Conversation slowly restarted, but the energy in the room had fundamentally shifted. The celebration that had been centered on Daniel and Emily now carried an undercurrent of something else entirely. My mother was the first to approach. She walked across the room on unsteady legs, her smile brittle and uncertain. "Margaret," she said, stopping beside my table. "I don't understand. Why didn't you tell us?" I looked up at her calmly. "You never asked." "But we could have. We would have. What treated me differently, given me a better seat?" She had no answer. My father appeared behind her, his expression a complicated mixture of anger and bewilderment. "This doesn't make sense. You were raising chickens. You were living in the middle of nowhere." "I was building a company. I still raise chickens. I still live in the country. One doesn't preclude the other." Daniel approached last, Emily trailing reluctantly behind him. His earlier confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced by something that looked almost like desperation. "Margaret," he said, his voice low. "I had no idea." "I know. Why didn't you say something when I made those comments earlier?" "I tried to say something 8 years ago. No one was interested in listening." He stood there, mouth opening and closing, unable to form a response. I rose from my chair and gathered my purse. "Enjoy the rest of your evening. It was a lovely party." I walked toward the exit, passing tables of guests who watched my departure with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. Behind me, I heard my mother call my name once, twice. I didn't look back. The music resumed, but the celebration had lost its center of gravity. I stepped into the hallway outside the ballroom and paused to collect myself. The evening had unfolded in ways I hadn't anticipated, but the fundamental dynamics remained unchanged. My family had shown me who they were. William Hartman had shown them who I was. The rest was simply mathematics. I found a quiet alcove near the coat check and sat down on a small bench, letting the muffled sounds of the party wash over me. Inside the ballroom, the social order was being recalculated in real time. I didn't need to see it to know what was happening. The executives who had been cultivating relationships with Daniel were now reassessing their positions. The guests who had treated me as invisible were now wondering what other details they had missed. The door opened, and Richard Chen stepped into the hallway. He spotted me in the alcove and walked over with an apologetic expression. "I hope that wasn't too overwhelming," he said. "William can be somewhat direct when he feels a point needs to be made." "I've handled worse." He sat down on the bench beside me. "I imagine you have. Building what you've built isn't for the faint of heart. Neither is sitting through a 3-hour engagement party at a table near the kitchen." He laughed softly. "No, I suppose not." He paused, considering his next words. "For what it's worth, I don't think William planned that speech. He's not the type to make grand gestures. But when he saw how you were being treated, something shifted." I noticed. "He respects competence, and he despises hypocrisy." Richard glanced toward the ballroom doors. "Your brother has built his reputation on connections and positioning. He's good at the game, but he's never had to prove himself the way you have. William sees that. William sees what's profitable. True. But in this case, those things align." Richard stood and buttoned his jacket. "I should get back, but I meant what I said earlier. I'd like to work with you more directly. Your approach to sustainable supply chains is exactly what we need for our next phase of expansion. Send me a proposal. We'll talk." He nodded and returned to the ballroom, leaving me alone with my thoughts. A few minutes later, the door opened again. This time it was Emily who emerged, her expression a complicated mixture of embarrassment and determination. She spotted me and hesitated, clearly uncertain whether to approach. I saved her the trouble. "You don't need to apologize," I said. "You didn't do anything wrong." She walked over slowly, her hands clasped in front of her. "That's not entirely true. I said some things earlier that were unkind. About your lifestyle. About the farm. You said what you believed. I said what Daniel believed, what his parents believed." She sat down on the bench, leaving a careful distance between us. "I didn't know anything about you. I just accepted what they told me. That's how families work sometimes." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Daniel is struggling in there. People are treating him differently. Some of the executives who were eager to talk to him earlier are now avoiding him." "That's not surprising." "No, I suppose it isn't." She looked at me directly. "Is his job at risk because of what happened tonight?" I considered the question. "I don't involve myself in personnel decisions at that level. Whatever happens to Daniel will be determined by his own performance and the judgment of his supervisors. But you could influence it if you wanted to." "I could, but I won't." Emily absorbed this, her expression thoughtful. "Why not? After everything they did to you, after the way they treated you tonight, why wouldn't you want some kind of revenge?" It was a fair question. I had asked it of myself many times over the years. "Because that's not what I built my life for," I said finally. "I didn't spend the last 8 years proving myself just to tear down someone else. Daniel's success or failure is his own responsibility. I have no interest in accelerating either outcome." Emily nodded slowly. "That's more generous than they deserve." "Maybe, but it's also more peaceful than carrying grudges." I stood and smoothed my dress. "Go back to your party. This is supposed to be your celebration." She rose as well, uncertainty still written across her face. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about all of it." "I know." She returned to the ballroom, and I remained in the hallway for a few more minutes, letting the silence settle around me. When I finally returned to the party, the atmosphere had changed completely. Daniel stood near the bar, alone, nursing a drink. The executives who had surrounded him earlier had dispersed to other conversations. Emily's parents were engaged in urgent discussion at their table, occasionally glancing in Daniel's direction, with expressions that suggested reassessment. My parents sat at the main table, frozen in a tableau of social discomfort. My mother stared at her hands. My father gazed at some distant point, his jaw tight. No one approached me as I walked to my table. But I felt their attention, the weight of recalibrated judgment, the shift in how I was perceived. The photographer circled the room, capturing candid moments. When he reached my corner, he paused. "Ms. Caldwell, would you like to be included in some of the photos? I could arrange a few shots if you're interested." "No, thank you. I think enough attention has been paid for one evening." He nodded and moved on. I sat down and watched the room continue its awkward reconfiguration. Daniel eventually abandoned the bar and returned to Emily's side, but their earlier ease had evaporated. The celebration continued, but the joy had drained from it. I had not asked for this. I had not planned for William's speech or the public acknowledgement that followed. I had simply shown up, taken the seat they assigned me, and waited to see how far they would go. They had gone far enough to expose themselves completely, and now they would have to live with the consequences. The party continued for another hour, but the energy never recovered. Guests departed earlier than expected, citing traffic or early morning obligations. The band played to a diminished crowd. The caterers began clearing empty tables while the remaining guests clustered in small groups, their conversations muted and careful. I remained at my table observing the slow dissolution of what should have been a triumphant evening. Daniel had retreated to a corner with his phone, his back to the room. Whatever conversation he was having, it wasn't pleasant. His shoulders were tense, his voice low but urgent. At one point he glanced back at me, then quickly looked away. Emily sat with her parents, their discussion clearly serious. Her mother's expression had hardened into something that resembled disappointment. Her father kept checking his watch, as if calculating how quickly they could leave without appearing rude. My parents remained at the main table, barely speaking to each other. My mother had stopped trying to maintain her social smile. My father stared at the tablecloth as if it held answers to questions he didn't want to ask. The evening was dying, and everyone knew it. William Hartman approached my table one final time. He had collected his coat and was clearly preparing to leave. "Ms. Caldwell, I apologize again for the disruption. It wasn't my intention to overshadow the celebration." "You said what needed to be said." "Perhaps, but the fallout may be significant." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Daniel will face consequences for how tonight unfolded. Not because of anything I'll do directly, but because the people in this room talk to each other. Reputations are built and broken on nights like this." "I understand." "I wanted to make sure you did. I also wanted to tell you that whatever happens next, it won't be personal. It will be about performance, competence, and fit, the same standards that apply to everyone." "I wouldn't expect anything different." He nodded once and extended his hand. "It was a pleasure meeting you in person. I look forward to our continued partnership." I shook his hand. "Likewise." He departed, and the room felt emptier for his absence. Daniel finished his phone call and walked toward me. His expression was a complicated mixture of anger, confusion, and something that might have been fear. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice strained. "We can talk." He sat down across from me, his hands flat on the table. "That phone call was from HR. They want to meet with me Monday morning, first thing." I said nothing. "Margaret, I need to know. Did you have anything to do with this?" "No." "But you knew. You knew what was going to happen tonight." "I didn't know anything. I came to your engagement party. I sat where I was told to sit. Everything else happened around me." He leaned forward, desperation creeping into his voice. "You could help me. You could talk to William, explain that this was all a misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding. You knew exactly who I was. You chose to treat me the way you did. I didn't know about your business. I didn't know you were involved with the company. You didn't know because you never asked, because you decided years ago that my choices made me worthless. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a judgment." Daniel's face flushed. "So you're just going to let this happen? You're going to watch me lose everything and do nothing?" "I'm not going to do anything because there's nothing for me to do. Your career, your relationships, your reputation, those are yours to manage. I've spent 8 years building my own life without any help from this family. You can figure out your problems on your own." He sat back, stunned by the finality in my voice. "Margaret, I'm your brother." "Yes. And tonight my brother told security to send me to the service entrance. My brother laughed when his fiancée mocked my lifestyle. My brother gave a speech thanking everyone in his life except me." I let the words settle between us. Being family doesn't mean I owe you rescue from your own choices. Daniel stared at me for a long moment, searching for something in my expression that he couldn't find. Then he stood abruptly and walked away without another word. I watched him cross the room to where Emily waited. They exchanged words too quiet to hear, then gathered their things and left through a side exit, avoiding the remaining guests. My parents approached next. My mother's eyes were red, her composure finally cracking. My father walked beside her with the rigid posture of a man trying to maintain dignity while everything crumbled around him. They stopped beside my table, neither of them sitting down. "Margaret," my mother began, her voice unsteady. "We need to talk about what happened tonight. There's not much to say, but there is. We had no idea about your success. If we had known, what would have changed? Would you have given me a better seat? Would you have mentioned my name in your speeches?" She had no answer. My father spoke for the first time since the revelation. "You should have told us. We're your family. We had a right to know." "You had no right to anything. You forfeited that when you decided I was a failure and wrote me off. I didn't owe you explanations then, and I don't owe them now." "That's not fair," my mother protested. "We were worried about you. We didn't understand why you were throwing your life away." "You didn't want to understand. There's a difference." The silence that followed was heavy with years of accumulated grievance. "So what happens now?" my father asked. "Are we supposed to just pretend this evening didn't happen?" "You can do whatever you want. I'm going back to my life, the one I built without you." My mother reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "Margaret, please, can't we start over?" "No, we can't." I stood and gathered my purse. Starting over implies that the past is forgiven. I'm not angry anymore, but I haven't forgotten. And I have no interest in rebuilding something that was broken from the beginning. I walked out of the ballroom without looking back. At the door, I paused and looked back one final time. My parents stood where I had left them, small figures in a room that had grown too large for their ambitions. They had wanted this night to be a celebration of family success. Instead, it had become something else entirely, a reckoning. The following morning, I woke early in my hotel room and watched the sunrise paint the Chicago skyline in shades of pink and gold. The city looked peaceful from 17 floors up distant and quiet, the previous night's drama fading like a half-remembered dream. I showered, dressed in comfortable traveling clothes, and packed my bag with methodical efficiency. My flight back to Indiana left in 3 hours. There was nothing keeping me in Chicago and everything waiting for me at home. My phone had accumulated messages overnight. Texts from business associates who had heard about the party. Emails from Richard Chen's office requesting a meeting. A voicemail from William Hartman's assistant confirming details for a conference call later in the week. Nothing from my family. I checked out of the hotel and was waiting for my car when my phone rang. My father's name appeared on the screen. I answered. "Margaret." His voice was strained, hesitant. "I'm glad you picked up." I almost didn't. A long pause. "We need to talk, in person, before you leave." "I'm heading to the airport in 20 minutes. "Then meet us somewhere between. Coffee, 15 minutes. That's all I'm asking." I considered refusing. It would have been easy, even satisfying, to simply hang up and let him stew in his own silence. But there was something in his voice I had never heard before. Not anger, not dismissal, something closer to uncertainty. "There's a cafe on Michigan Avenue, the one near the park. I can give you 10 minutes. "We'll be there." I hung up and redirected my driver. The cafe was nearly empty at this hour, the morning rush still an hour away. I chose a table near the window and ordered black coffee, watching pedestrians pass by on the sidewalk outside. My parents arrived together, my mother's eyes still red from what I assumed was a sleepless night. My father moved stiffly, the confident posture of the previous evening replaced by something diminished. They sat down across from me without ordering. "Thank you for meeting us," my mother said. "I know you didn't have to." "I know." My father cleared his throat. "We've been talking, all night actually, about you, about what happened, about the things we said and did. And we were wrong." The words seemed to cost him something. "We were wrong about you, about your choices, about everything." I sipped my coffee and waited. "When you left the bank," he continued, "we thought you were making a mistake. We thought you were throwing away everything you had worked for, and instead of supporting you, we pushed you away." "You did more than push. You erased me. You stopped inviting me to family gatherings. You stopped asking about my life. You treated me like an embarrassment." "Yes." He looked down at the table. "We did." My mother reached across the table toward my hand, then stopped, remembering how I had pulled away the night before. "We're not asking for forgiveness," she said quietly. "We know we don't deserve it. But we wanted you to know that we see now. We see what you built. We see who you are." I set down my coffee cup. "And what difference does that make?" They both looked startled by the question. "I spent 8 years proving myself to people who mattered," I continued, "building relationships with people who saw my value from the beginning, creating something meaningful from nothing. And through all of that, I never needed your approval. I never needed you to see me." My father's expression tightened. "We're still your parents." "Yes, you are. But that doesn't mean you still get a say." The words landed with the force I intended. My mother's eyes filled with tears. My father looked as if I had struck him. "Margaret," my mother whispered. "Please." "Please what?" "Please pretend. The last 8 years didn't happen. Please forget how you laughed when I told you about the farm. Please overlook the fact that you seated me near the kitchen at my own brother's engagement party. We made mistakes. You made choices. There's a difference. Mistakes are accidents. What you did was deliberate. You decided who I was, and you treated me accordingly." My father's jaw tightened. "So what do you want? An apology?" "We're giving you one." "I don't want an apology. I don't want anything from you. I'm here because you asked me to be, and because I believe in closure. So here it is." I stood and gathered my bag. "I'm not angry anymore. I stopped being angry a long time ago, but I'm also not interested in rebuilding something that never existed. You can be proud of me now if you want. You can tell your friends about your successful daughter, but you don't get to be part of my life just because you finally noticed it's worth being part of." My mother rose from her chair. "Margaret, wait, please. Can't we at least try?" I looked at her, at the desperation in her eyes, at the way her hands trembled slightly. "No," I said gently. "I don't go backward anymore." I walked out of the cafe without looking back. My driver was waiting at the curb. I climbed into the back seat and gave him the address for the airport. As we pulled away, I allowed myself one glance in the side mirror. My parents stood outside the cafe, watching my car disappear into traffic. They looked small, lost. I turned forward and let them fade from view. The drive to the airport passed in comfortable silence. The city gave way to highways, to sprawling suburbs, to the flat expanse of agricultural land that had become my home. I boarded my flight and settled into my seat, watching Illinois shrink beneath me until it was nothing but a patchwork of fields and roads. By mid-afternoon, I was back on my farm. The familiar sounds greeted me as I stepped out of my car. The distant clucking of chickens, the hum of ventilation systems in the processing facility, the crunch of gravel under work boots as my farm manager walked toward me with a clipboard and a smile. "Welcome back," Rachel said. "How was the party?" "Educational," she laughed. "That good, huh?" "Well, you didn't miss much here. The new feed delivery came in yesterday and we're ahead of schedule on the organic certification paperwork." "Perfect. Walk me through it." We spent the next hour touring the facilities, reviewing numbers, discussing plans for the upcoming quarter. Rachel had been with me for 5 years, one of the first employees I hired when the operation expanded beyond what I could manage alone. She was competent, loyal, and entirely uninterested in my family drama. It was exactly what I needed. That evening, I sat on my porch and watched the sun set over the fields. The sky turned orange, then pink, then a deep purple that faded slowly into darkness. Stars emerged one by one, more than I had ever seen in Chicago, more than I had ever noticed when I was too busy chasing someone else's definition of success. My phone buzzed with a text from William Hartman's assistant, confirming our conference call for the following week. Another message from Richard Chen suggesting a meeting in Indianapolis next month. A notification from my accountant about quarterly projections. Nothing from my family. I set the phone aside and let the silence settle around me. The next morning, I joined a video call with my advisory board. We discussed expansion opportunities, strategic partnerships, the environmental certifications that had become our competitive advantage. No one mentioned the engagement party. No one asked about my brother or my parents. They talked to me as they always had, as a colleague, a decision maker, someone whose opinion mattered because of what I had built, not because of where I came from. After the call, I drove into town for supplies. The hardware store owner greeted me by name and asked about the new solar panels I was considering. The feed supplier wanted my advice on a contract dispute with another client. The local banker invited me to speak at a business development seminar next spring. These were people who had watched me build something from nothing. They had seen me work 18-hour days during harvest season. They had loaned me money when the banks wouldn't. They had believed in my vision when my own family called it foolish. Their respect meant more than any social acknowledgement ever could. That afternoon, a package arrived at the farm. Inside was a framed article from an agricultural trade publication featuring a profile of sustainable poultry operations in the Midwest. My name appeared prominently alongside photographs of the facilities I had designed and the team I had assembled. The article had been published months ago, but I had never bothered to save a copy. Someone had done it for me. The note inside was brief. "Thought you should have this. Congratulations on everything. R.C. Richard Chen." The man who had sat beside me at my brother's engagement party and treated me like an equal before anyone else in that room understood why. I hung the frame in my office next to the window overlooking the processing facility. Over the following days, life returned to its normal rhythms. Early mornings reviewing production reports, midday meetings with suppliers and distributors, evenings spent reading industry journals or walking the property with Rachel discussing improvements and innovations. The engagement party receded into memory, becoming just another event in a long series of events that had shaped my path. My family did not call. They did not write. They did not show up unannounced, seeking reconciliation. I was grateful for their silence. A week after the party, I received word through business channels that Daniel had been reassigned within his company, not fired outright, but moved to a position with less responsibility and lower visibility. A demotion dressed up in corporate language. I felt no satisfaction at the news, no vindication, just a quiet acknowledgement that actions have consequences and that the universe sometimes delivers its own form of justice. Emily's family had postponed the wedding indefinitely. The official reason was scheduling conflicts, but the real reason circulated through the social networks that connected their world to mine. The alliance that had seemed so advantageous a week ago now looked like a liability. I did not gloat. I did not comment. I simply continued building the life I had chosen. On the anniversary of buying the farm, I stood in the middle of my largest pasture and looked out over everything I had created. The barns I had rebuilt, the processing facility I had designed, the sustainable practices I had pioneered. This was my legacy, not the approval of people who had dismissed me, not the acknowledgement of a society that valued connection over competence, just the quiet satisfaction of having done something real. I didn't need them to see it. I had outgrown the room that required their validation. A month passed before Daniel finally reached out. The message came late one evening, a text appearing on my phone while I was reviewing contracts at my kitchen table. "Margaret, I know I don't deserve it, but I need to talk. Please." I stared at the words for a long moment, then set the phone aside and returned to my work. He tried again the next day, and the day after that. Each message is slightly more desperate than the last. "I lost the promotion. Emily's family is pulling back. I don't know what to do. Please, just tell me what you need me to say. Margaret, I'm sorry for everything. Please answer me." I read each message as it arrived, then deleted it without responding. On the fourth day, my mother called. I let it go to voicemail. "Margaret, honey, it's Mom. Daniel is struggling. He's lost so much in the past few weeks. I know things between us are difficult, but he's your brother. Please consider reaching out. Please." I deleted the voicemail and blocked her number. That weekend, I drove to Indianapolis for my meeting with Richard Chen. We discussed partnership opportunities, supply chain innovations, and the strategic direction of the industry. He never mentioned Daniel or the engagement party. As I was leaving, he paused at the door of his office. "Miss Caldwell, may I offer an observation?" "Of course." "In my experience, the most successful people in business are those who know when to close a door and move forward. You seem to have that quality in abundance." "Thank you. But I've also noticed that closed doors sometimes attract persistent knocking. If that becomes a problem, don't hesitate to reinforce the locks." I smiled. "I'll keep that in mind." On the drive home, I thought about his words, the persistent knocking, the need to reinforce locks. My family had spent years dismissing me, and now that I had proven them wrong, they wanted access to the life they had rejected. Not because they had changed, not because they finally understood, but because my success had value they wanted to claim. I would not give them that satisfaction. Spring arrived, bringing longer days and the familiar rhythms of planting season. The farm hummed with activity. New employees joined the team. New contracts were signed. The business continued to grow in ways that exceeded even my most optimistic projections. In April, I received a letter from my father, handwritten, which was unusual for a man who preferred typed correspondence. "Margaret, I understand why you're not responding to calls. I understand why you've pulled away. But I need you to know that I was wrong about you, not just about your business, but about the person you became. You have more strength and vision than I ever gave you credit for. I'm proud of you, even if I have no right to be. Your father." I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. Pride. He was proud of me now. 8 years of silence, dismissal, and erasure, and now he was proud. I wrote a response and mailed it the next day. "Dad, I received your letter. I appreciate the sentiment, but it doesn't change anything between us. You're welcome to be proud from a distance. That's where our relationship will remain. Margaret." The response was brief, factual, and final. I never heard from him again. Summer brought the annual agricultural conference in Des Moines. I delivered a keynote speech on sustainable farming practices to a room of industry professionals who treated me as an authority, a pioneer, someone whose opinions shaped the direction of their field. No one asked about my family. No one wondered why I had chosen this path instead of the one my parents had envisioned. They saw only what I had built and judged me accordingly. That evening, I walked through downtown Des Moines and found a quiet bench overlooking the river. The city lights reflected on the water, creating patterns that shifted and reformed with each passing current. I thought about the woman I had been 8 years ago, unhappy in her corner office, trapped by expectations that had never been her own, dreaming of something different but afraid to reach for it. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone stronger, more certain, more fully herself. The family that had tried to define me no longer held any power over my story. I stood, brushed off my skirt, and walked back to my hotel. The next morning, I flew home to the farm that had become my kingdom. Rachel met me at the gate with updates on the week's progress. The processing facility was running at full capacity. The organic certification had been renewed. A new contract with a regional grocery chain would increase distribution by 30%. "Not bad for a chicken farmer," Rachel said with a grin. "Not bad at all." I spent the rest of the day walking the property, checking on the birds, reviewing the improvements we had made since my last inspection. Everything was exactly as it should be. That evening, I sat on my porch and watched the sun set over fields that belonged to me. They had called me just a farmer. They had dismissed my choices and my dreams. They had seated me near the service entrance and laughed at the idea that I could ever amount to anything. I let them keep their world. I built my own. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who should have believed in you, remember this: you don't need their approval to succeed. You don't need their acknowledgement to matter. You just need the courage to build something real and the patience to let it speak for itself. And if this story touched something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are more of us than they realize quietly building empires while they're too busy looking the